I just want to open with a couple of words. The Nazi ideology of ethnic cleansing was driven by hatred. We all know that. This is no deep thought. And it was totally irrational, totally unscientific. It made no sense. It was a bad idea. And bad ideas don't work. It didn't work. That's why you are here. That's why we are all here. That's why there are millions of Jews still around the world, living good lives, being good citizens, and proving to the world that they are not inferior to any other culture or ethnic group or any other religion. So I just wanted to say those few words before going and showing you, I guess the picture is okay, showing you very quickly a quick narrative about what happened and how we moved through this Holocaust scenario. The fact that what I went through is typical. This is really not a special experience because millions of people went through the same thing. The only thing that's special about me is that I was lucky to survive. And that was really a miracle because at the age of 12, there were probably out of hundreds of thousands of children below the age of 13 or 14, less than 300 or 400 perhaps survived. So the miracle is the miracle of survival, not what we went through, because millions of prisoners like me and like my family went through the same thing, through very similar experiences. So I just wanted to point that out because what you're going to see is a typical experience. This is the city of Prague where I grew up. Very beautiful and highly cultural city. This is the apartment where we lived on the second floor, where you see that rectangular white window. My father was a physician, a pianist, a musician, and a physician, most of all a physician, really. And I was surrounded by a lot of art and culture. And I became an artist, or I tried to be, at an early age. We were deported after the Nazis invaded the country. And of course the country became very anti-Semitic with the German propaganda. We were deported to the ghetto of Terezin, or as the Germans called it, Theresienstadt, named after Maria Theresa, who was the leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a long time. And there in Terezin, which was a walled city, we were in Terezin in a children's home that was a converted school, a public school. So they converted, basically the Nazis basically pushed everyone out of Terezin, all the Czech families that lived there, and then made it into a Jewish ghetto. They vacated the whole town, converted it into a Jewish ghetto, converted the schools into living quarters, because we didn't have any form of schooling. And we were immediately separated from our parents. The parents were separated from each other. Men were living in men's barracks, women were living in women's barracks, and we were living in the, I was in a boys' school with my brother. My brother was 4 years older, so he was on a different floor, in a different classroom. But you can see how the classrooms were converted into sleeping quarters with bunk beds. We were in Terezin from the summer of 1942 till the December of 1943. And in Terezin, which I need to tell you a little bit about food, which was always critical. In Terezin, we had scarcity of food, but we were not starving to death. We had enough food, I'm talking about children, had enough food to survive. I think the grown-ups that was a different story. There was really not enough food for the grown-ups. So it was for the grown-ups, it was a little bit of a starvation diet. In Terezin, I had the experience of a boy that was in my classroom running in one day and telling me that his grandmother just fell into a coma, and when I asked him why do you think that happened, he said that she was told that she was going to be deported east. And then when she heard that she was going to be deported east, she took a bunch of sleeping pills and fell into a coma. That was the first time that I heard that there was such a thing as deportation out of Terezin. And I realized then, at the age of 12, that Terezin was only a temporary transition camp. We had approximately 30,000 people in Terezin, prisoners in Terezin, and it never really increased beyond that level. People were coming in, but other people were being shipped out. Our family was invited or requested to assemble at the railroad station in December of 1943 in Terezin, and we were shipped in cattle cars to Auschwitz, where we immediately went on a severe starvation diet. We ended up in Auschwitz in the middle of December. It was extremely cold. We were tattooed, we were shaved, we were given showers, we were given striped uniforms, and we were immediately put on approximately a 600 or 700 calorie diet a day, which was totally unsustainable in the cold weather particularly. And we were starving from day one. We realized, even as a child, I realized that Auschwitz was an extermination camp. I saw the smoke and the ashes coming out of the chimneys every day. I knew that transports were coming in onto the railroad station and disappearing in the crematorium. And it only took me 2 or 3 weeks to realize that this was a very serious, very threatening extermination camp. And as you already heard, on my second or third day in Auschwitz, I by accident met Dina Gottlieb, who was a artist. I saw her painting in my mother's barrack, and I made an acquaintance with her, spoke to her. I admired her paintings and became really a close friend of hers. This is the surrounding barbed wire of Auschwitz. This is all you saw when you entered the camp. The camp was one of the largest. Here is an aerial photo of the camp. This is one of the largest, was one of the largest concentration camps in Europe at that time. And you can see the inside of the barracks here. And again, we were separated from the female male were separated, and so the male boys were with their parent, with their fathers. The female girls, the girls were with their mothers. And this was made into what was at that time called family camp. It was very unusual. This was the only family camp in Auschwitz. We found out after the war that the reason for the family camp was that Berlin was concerned about the International Red Cross coming into Terezin. And they wanted to make sure that if too many questions were asked about where are these people being shipped to from Terezin, they would use Auschwitz and the family camp as an example that we are shipping these people, but we are keeping them together, we are keeping them fed, reasonably fed, which was a lie, obviously, but we are not separating them and we're not gassing them. So they wanted one specific camp as a show camp in case the Red Cross would come in. It turned out that about 5 or 6 months later, Berlin was told that that the Red Cross is not going to investigate any further than they did, and they did go into Terezin for a very quick, brief visit, and they were told that they were satisfied with their investigation and that there would be no further visits, and that's when, in March of 1944, the first group of the prisoners that came in September to Auschwitz, to the family camp, were gassed. So roughly about 5,000 or 6,000 were gassed in the first or second week of March of 1944. In the following July, the December transport, which is our transport, was threatened. And you can see here some of the pictures of the liberated children of Auschwitz in 1945. And this is Dr. Mengele, who Dina Gottlieb, the artist, was painting for. She was asked by Dr. Mengele to paint portraits of gypsies prior to them being gassed, because Dr. Mengele wanted very accurate portraits, including color and all the necessary coloring of the eyes and skin coloring, because he didn't trust color photography at that time. Color photography was rather primitive. So he asked her to paint these pictures, these portraits of gypsies prior to their gassing. This is one of the portraits that's now at the Polish Museum, at the Auschwitz Museum in Poland. There were about 6 or 7 other pictures that she did. I think there are 4 that were recovered after the war and that are at the museum. Mengele, of course, conducted some terribly awful experiments on the twins. And here is a picture of Heinrich Himmler and the head of the camp of the Heinrich Himmler on the left, and Höss on the right, who was the head of the Auschwitz camp. This is when Himmler visited the camp in 1943. Here is Hess after his arrest. He was imprisoned in Poland after the war and executed. The gassing went on in tremendous quantities in the spring and summer of 1944. After the selection of the December transport, when we came into Auschwitz, you already heard what happened. I was standing in line. I was going to be gassed. I was on death row with a bunch of other 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old children. And Willy Brachmann, the man that I worked for in Auschwitz, I was his runner, his Läufer in German, his assistant. I would be running errands for him. Suddenly, as I'm standing in this line of children that were doomed to be gassed, Willy Brachmann came out of the group of people, grabbed me by my left shoulder, and shoved me into a group of kids that were 14 years and 15 years old and disappeared. And I never saw Willy Brachmann again, but that's who saved my life in July of 1945. Here you see a picture for the denials, for the people that want to deny the Holocaust, because one of their arguments was that the crematoria and the gas chambers, but particularly the crematoria, could not handle the volumes of 6,000 to 8,000 people a day. Well, the deniers were right. They couldn't handle the crematoria could not handle the dead bodies. That's why they were burning the bodies outside. And here is a picture, is a document, an SS photograph of the pits that were built behind the crematorium, because they simply could not burn all the dead bodies inside in the crematorium ovens. They burned them outside in the pits by the hundreds of thousands. Here is, of course, a picture of some of the warehouses with the with the clothing that was left behind by the prisoners. And we were then, in January of 1945, shipped by not only on foot for 2 days in a death march, where we had absolutely no food at all, but we walked for 2 days to a railroad station, and from that railroad station in Poland, we were put on trains, open trains, and we were shipped to the concentration camp of Mauthausen. On the way to Mauthausen in open trains, we again had absolutely no food at all. This was a 2-day trip. And we reached the Czech border and went through the city of Moravska. In Czech, it's called Moravská Ostrava. In German, it's Mörrische Ostrau. And there on the railroad station, Czech women saw us in the open cars, and they were coal cars, open coal cars. They were throwing food into the coal cars. And actually, one of them was shot by the SS when they saw her. One of the women was shot when they saw her throwing food into the cars. They threw oranges, lemons, bread, flour, anything that they had in their shopping baskets, they threw into the train. We kept on going, and we traveled through the Czech Republic into Austria. And on that trip, we could eat some of the food, but the thing that I remember the best was that someone ended up with a bunch of lemons, and someone ended up with a bag of sugar. And then when we stopped and we could go out into the snow to really relieve ourselves, somebody picked up some snow, mixed it with the lemons and the sugar, and made lemon ice. I still love lemon ice from that moment. We arrived in Mauthausen, and Mauthausen was a terribly serious, terribly offensive camp. We arrived in Mauthausen and walked up these 100 or 90 or 100 steps, hardly made it up the steps, and we went through the showers. And there, the men that I was with, a couple of dentists that I was with, Jewish dentists, one of them suddenly started crying, and he just went wild. And I found out that a prisoner that was already in Mauthausen went to him and said, "Give us all of your shoes and your clothing because you're going into a gas chamber." And so these guys just went berserk, and we didn't give anybody any shoes. We did go through the showers. We didn't get gassed, obviously, and we went into the camp of Mauthausen, which was a extremely difficult camp, even though it was not an extermination camp in the scientific sense. It was a camp where people died of typhoid fever, hunger, and just hard work and disease. Mauthausen had a quarry. This is the entrance to Mauthausen. Mauthausen had a quarry, and one of the things that the SS would do is they didn't like a prisoner, or if the prisoner wasn't performing on the quarry, cutting quickly enough or carrying enough stone, they would throw him down from the top of the quarry down to the bottom and kill him that way. So it was a killing quarry as well as a working quarry. In Mauthausen, again, a little bit of a food detail. Mauthausen was a starvation camp, terrible starvation camp. There was very little food in Mauthausen. And we had a German Shepherd SS dog run up against the electric wire and basically committed suicide. So immediately the prisoners took the dog, cut him up, made a bonfire, and we started eating the dog. Well, I got a small piece of meat about the size of my thumb, and I couldn't eat it. It was too tough. So don't ever try to eat dog food, real dog food. Here is a picture of some of the prisoners in Mauthausen, and this is really what they look like. This is a picture taken by the U.S. Army when Mauthausen was liberated in 45, in May of 45. And this is what we look like. This is a 14-year-old boy who was just liberated by the American Army in Mauthausen. And this is what everybody looked like. These are the death pits in Mauthausen. So again, Mauthausen did not have the crematoria to get rid of, to burn the corpses, so they basically threw them into the death pits. This is the head of Mauthausen camp, Frank Grunwald. He's the one whose son was shooting prisoners from Zierreich's porch. Zierreich's house was very near Mauthausen, the camp, within a shooting distance of the camp. So he allowed his son, his 14-year-old son, to take a rifle and shoot the prisoners from the porch of his home. He was also executed after the war. We then traveled from Mauthausen down to another camp called Melk. Melk was another starvation camp. And in Melk, we had very little food. We were all starving. And we, meaning the children, every day we had to go into the kitchen and peel potatoes. We very often ate the raw potatoes as we were peeling them. We spent several months in Melk. From Melk, we went back to Mauthausen for a few weeks, and then from Mauthausen to a camp about 22 miles away called Gunskirchen. You can see it on the southwest side, pretty much at the end on the left side of the map. Gunskirchen was a camp in the woods, and apparently here is the story that we got from the citizens and the people that knew what was going on. The commandant of Gunskirchen, we were dumped into his camp. He didn't expect us, but we were dumped into his camp because the SS was walking us much farther. The plan was to walk us much farther into an area called Abendsee, meaning evening lake, or Abendsee caverns. These were caverns, underground caverns, where they were going to put all the prisoners and shoot them. But because of the American army was coming so fast, they could never get us to Abendsee. So they dumped us off in Gunskirchen, which was a camp without running water, without any facilities to speak of. And in Gunskirchen we were for 5 days, mostly without food. We only got food the first 2 days. And in Gunskirchen we were liberated by the 71st Infantry Third Army, which was Patton's Third Army. And here are pictures of the prisoners in the Gunskirchen woods forest. And the problem there was that on the 5th or on the 4th of May of 1945, when the American soldiers came in, they could not tell who was alive and who was dead. It was really difficult to tell because some of these people are still alive, and some of them, of course, were dead. So it was a very, very difficult, trying period for the American army to save the ones that were still alive, and then to bury the ones that did not make it. This is a picture of Dina, who introduced me to her boyfriend Willie. She survived the war. This is a picture of her in France after the war with her mother. Here is a picture of my brother, who was 4 years older, and I. I'm about 5 in that picture, and my brother is about 9. And this is a picture of my mother, who was gassed in July of 1944 at the age of 39. And here is my father, who was a physician who survived the war. So basically, this is me about 3 or 4 months after the war. So in a nutshell, this is the story. And as I say, this is not a unique story. The only thing that's unique is that I'm still here. Thank you very much.